Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Hunt Science Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Lance, a professionally certified wildlife biologist and natural resource professional, college professor, and owner of Land Source Consulting. The Hunt Science Podcast is dedicated to bring you the latest information on popular habitat management topics, wildlife science, hunting strategies, and the general conservation and land management practices to help preserve our natural resources. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to have you with us and hope that you enjoy today's episode. With that said, let's get started. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by our primary sponsor, Land Source Consulting. Land Source Consulting is an Ohio-based wildlife and land management consulting company that I own and operate not only here in Ohio, but through the Midwest and beyond. At Land Source, we work with private landowners just like you to build and develop those property-specific management programs to help bring the goals that you have on your property to life. If you're interested in getting more information on who we are and how we can help you, please visit us over at landsourceconsulting.com. There you can check out the different service packages and capabilities that we can provide. We would love to hear from you, so don't hesitate to reach out to us and schedule that free consultation either through our website, or you can reach out to us and connect with us on our other social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. That's landsourceconsulting.com, building relationships for a more sustainable future. All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Hunt Science Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Lance, welcoming those of you that are new to the show and thanking those who are returning once again for another episode. On today's episode, I have Matt Ross from the National Deer Association. Matt is a professionally certified wildlife biologist, but he's also a certified forester. He's the director of conservation over at the NDA, and Matt and Kip are very, very good duos as far as information in the whitetail world. The two of those guys are just an absolute wealth of information. Those of you who have heard the show, we've had Kip on in the past, and of course, I've got to have his counterpart, in my opinion, Matt Ross, joining us today. Matt is someone who I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to over the years. Just like Kip, Matt is an absolute wealth of information. He's worked in a lot of different capacities in the whitetail world as a consultant and, other aspects, around whitetail deer. His background in forestry is really something unique. You don't see a lot of wildlife biologists that also are certified foresters. So he brings that to every lecture and every interview that he does, which was another reason why I wanted him on the show. So Matt, like I said, I've known him for a couple years and had the fortune to listen to him talk at some lectures and things like that, and just absolutely had to have him on. On today's episode with Matt, we originally started wanting to talk about more forestry-related stuff, and generally as podcasts can go, the topics of conversation kind of deviated, and we went down some rabbit holes, and nonetheless, it was a very good episode, but we're definitely going to have to do a part two and really hammer out some forestry-related things for whitetail deer. But nonetheless, it's an exciting episode I think everyone's going to enjoy. So with that, let's get this episode started. I want to welcome everybody and thank everybody once again for tuning in to the Hunt Science Podcast, and let's get started with Matt Ross. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Hunt Science Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Lance, and as I mentioned before, I'm joined today by Matt Ross from the NDA. Matt, how you doing, buddy?
What's going on, Eric? Happy to be here. The sun is shining. It's been rainy here, so it's nice to look out my window and see some sun.
It's been so rainy here, man. Like, I'm over it. Both my daughters play travel softball, and we were just out at a scrimmage yesterday. And I'm like, it's May. And we're out there in hats, and I'm in my hunting jacket. I'm like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, man, welcome. Thank you for coming on to the show. I had Kip on prior, and you are the second person from the NDA. The NDA, as everyone knows and has heard me mention before, was formerly the QDMA, the Quality Management Association, and it's something that I've pushed a lot, something I talk about a lot because I'm a big believer in what you guys are doing and the things that you guys had to offer. So when I started this podcast, you and Kip were like, you, Kip, and Craig were like the three, excuse me, and you guys were the three that I was like, okay, we got it. First, at least like first 5 episodes, got to get you guys on here. So thank you again for coming on, man.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so we've seen each other quite a bit because I've done all the modules and
Hmm.
things like that, and we'll get into that the NDA has to offer. But just what I start with everybody, why don't we just kind of take it from the beginning? Who you are, where you're from, and then what kind of led you down the path of becoming a wildlife biologist and forester, and kind of towards the NDA's doorstep.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share a little bit about my history and what got me here. So I'm the director of conservation for the NDA, as you mentioned. I am talking to you right now from upstate New York. I'd say upstate. It's basically anything that's not New York City we say is upstate. But I grew up in New York. Grew up in a family that introduced me to hunting, so I was a more traditional outset. My dad hunted, my uncle hunted, my cousins. We belonged to a stereotypical rod and gun club, and I would go there for weekends, and so had the typical introduction. My dad was growing up, he was a police officer, and also was really into firearms too. So had that introduction as well, not only to hunting but shooting sports and all that. But I decided I just eaten up with it so much. As a kid that I loved deer hunting, and really once I started bow hunting, my dad didn't bow hunt but my uncle did. He showed me the ropes on how to bow hunt. um, that is what really slowed down my thought process, and not just being excited to be out there and shoot things, but like watch animals, observe them. Bow hunting was really what did it. It was like, wow, all the stuff that's happening in the woods. And I just wanted to turn that into a career, similar to you, I'm sure. It's just like, okay, how do I do this for a living? You're getting into high school. And so I looked at colleges around the Northeast for undergraduate, which ones had wildlife. I actually shadowed a wildlife biologist in high school. My guidance office allowed us to like spend a day following somebody. And so luckily, that uncle I was talking about knew somebody that was one of the wildlife folks there at the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. So I got to do that for the day, which I loved. And that person told me what schools were good, and at that time I was probably a junior, applied to a couple of different colleges for undergraduate, and I ended up going to school for wildlife in Massachusetts, so a couple hours away from home. And then once I finished that, I actually came back and worked seasonal technician work for the state agency here in New York, and pretty quickly decided that I wanted to go back to graduate school if I wanted to do something. So ended up getting a graduate degree, went to New Hampshire for that, and worked on a project with deer. That was my primary interest, to do something with an antlered animal, moose, deer, elk. And so I applied to schools in Texas and Nevada, um, and ended up getting a project in New Hampshire doing stuff with deer. There at the time they had a deer lab similar to some of the schools in the South that you hear today, and had deer, captive deer. We got to work with those deer and then do stuff in the field as well. So, and that's actually where you mentioned Kip. That's where I met Kip Adams. He was the deer and bear biologist for the state of New Hampshire. And so I went there for graduate school, and he was on my advisory committee. He's a few years older than I am, not a lot, but he's a few years older, because the project I worked on funded was funded from the state agency. Primary funding came from the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, and they wanted to make sure that their money was being well spent. So they assigned their deer biologist to the project to basically oversee it. And midstream, I was like halfway through my project, he left the position and started working for the then QDMA. And that's actually how I heard of the organization. I was like, "You're going where? What's this group?" I'd heard
Yeah.
of other NGOs, the non-governmental organizations like Ducks Unlimited and Turkey Federation, but I'd never heard of a deer group, a group for deer hunters. And all the while, I was hunting. I actually met some of my closest friends in New Hampshire through hunting, through school, but also we hunted together, and I joined, really. I mean, I was like, okay, so I lost a committee member, but I joined the QDMA and was a member. And then when I finished school, I worked as a consultant for a couple of years. Got a consulting job, forestry wildlife consulting, and actually started a local volunteer branch of QDMA. And so I did that. I was a vice president of the branch. That branch actually still exists today. Um, and then eventually, like other members, I got the magazine, uh, the branch. We held fundraisers, we held field days. Eventually, I saw a posting in, believe it or not, in the magazine, thinking about, back then, and for a job. And so I applied and originally was hired as a regional director. And so that did working with volunteers basically, helping them do educational events, helping them do fundraisers, like set up banquets. And I knew it was a far cry from what I had gone to school for, but I wanted my foot in the door. And that was actually, believe it or not, Eric, I was just telling my wife, we're talking here, it's May 5th as we're recording. I just celebrated my 16th anniversary. Actually, May 1st, I was hired, 2006. And so I
Nice.
evolved over the years and had 4 or 5 different positions, and now I oversee some of our field staff and do some other things at the now NDA. Been here a long time. And you mentioned our deer steward courses. I got to oversee those for some time, but I still work for Kip that whole time. He was my on my
Nice.
advisory committee, and then
Can't shake him.
for a short period of time, I didn't have him as a supervisor, but once I got hired, he wasn't originally. But then once my first shift in positions when I worked in the conservation department, Kip's been my boss for a long time. So
There
we're
you go.
friends, but he's my boss.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's always interesting to hear because my path was a lot different. I started off. I knew I wanted to do something science related. I was a wildlife nerd when I was a kid. I people have heard me say it before. I didn't grow up in a hunting family. I had an uncle that hunt. I'm not close with him, so nothing I ever went out to. I fished, more than anything. But as far as hunting, but me and my cousins were always out catching, snakes and turtles and frogs, and my grandparents on my dad's side lived out in this big campground, so we were just always out in the woods. Like that's what we did. And it really wasn't until undergrad because I was going to veterinary medicine. That's what I wanted to do. I loved medicine and I loved, wildlife. And I was like, well, here we go. Like I shadowed some vets in school and, then when I went to college, it kind of solidified the deal. But I was like, hey, as I started getting further down into the veterinary field, I was like stuck in the small animal, large animal. And I was like, I wanted to try to do like a game service, like go out and be a wildlife vet. Yeah, good luck with that. My wife and I got, we got pregnant and for the first time, and it just kind of wasn't in the cards after that. So, plan B, I was like, I'm gonna go be a wildlife biologist, right? And at that point, it was a little bit late in my career, or a little kind of late in, not really late in life, but I had a family. I got a newborn, I got a wife, and I'm like, what do you? My life would have been different if I would have known I wanted to be a wildlife biologist in the beginning. Because when my wife and I were together, I mean, I had opportunities to go out and work out west and go be a bear biologist or go be like whatever. And I'm like, nah, like man, I missed like 10 years, five to 10 years of that. Could have been like you said, getting your foot in the door. But I mean, it is what it is. I
How
love
did
what I do
how
now,
did
but.
you curious? How did you first decide to start hunting? What inspired you to do that?
So I was in undergrad. It was so I played baseball in college, and my second year, sophomore year, yeah, my roommate was one of the baseball players, and he was a big hunter. And I had always been kind of interested in hunting, but for those probably people listening, for those who don't know where to start, I didn't have anybody
Yeah.
like to help me at all, and he was a diehard hunter. And his, he's probably gonna listen to this, but he started off like we were there. I was a biology major, pre-vet in undergrad, and he was a conservation science major. He's like, man, my dream job, I want to go work for Whitetails Unlimited, be a conservation biologist, blah 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 blah. And now he's a financial advisor. It's funny, like complete 180.
Yeah.
And here I was in the beginning going in to be a veterinarian, and now I'm actually the biologist working in the field. It's funny because we'll talk every once in a while. But anyway, it was after a baseball practice, and I went out to help him set up some deer stands, and just kind of being out in the woods, and watching him and asking questions on where he's putting his stand and why he's doing it here. Because in my head, I've mentioned this, I think, with Craig. As like when I first started hunting, I put a stand up. I'm like, well, here's a deer trail. I'm like, yeah, you put the stand right on the deer trail, right? So I'm like, I got it like basically straddling the deer trail. Like I just didn't know what I was doing, and it was I was, early to mid 20s when I started hunting. But then, as I really kind of got out of the veterinary field and really started going back again, through graduate school, but this time on the conservation natural resources side, I'm like, okay, and you start hammering. That's when I found the NDA and then QDMA, and really kind of started going down this path. And at that time, I was working as a biologist for a consulting firm, kind of doing a lot of different things at the time. I was doing a lot of fish work, a lot of bird surveys, and just kind of I was the gray man, kind of between each department, where they needed me, what they needed to do, that kind of thing. But then I started really getting into it, But I was a late bloomer. But
Well, that's great. I mean, like whether you asked him or he said, "Hey, tag along," we're finding
yeah, I can't remember.
more and more, with people that, we all have it, whether people admit it or not. It's all in our DNA is to hunt, and to know where your food comes from and all of those cliche sayings. But a lot of people don't. It's a major obstacle. It's a major barrier. If you don't have somebody, and so kudos to your buddy. For taking some time to show
Yeah.
you. That's great.
I think it was more that we wanted to blow off class and go do this because we had baseball practice or something later. We're like, listen, it ain't gonna happen later because we had obligations like you can't miss. But I was like, yeah, we're gonna blow off chemistry or
Yeah.
whatever the hell it was. I don't know, but yeah, it's I can't remember exactly what happened, but I just remember that was kind of the turning point because I was like, okay, there's something to this. And even going off what you said now is, I tell people all the time, I love hunting, but honestly, I love the science, more than I actually do hunting. Like I'm perfectly fine sitting in a deer stand and not, well, I'm not going to say I'm perfectly fine not seeing deer, but, passing deer, which is probably another episode, which you guys are hopefully going to be recurring guests. We can talk about, aging and population dynamics and age
Oh,
structure and
that's, I
things like
mean,
that.
the title
Yeah.
of your podcast, Hunt
Yeah.
Science. I mean,
Yeah.
I
So,
do have that thirst too of what,
yeah.
what makes things tick, like not
Yeah.
only do
I
I
mean,
like the predator part of it, but like
yeah.
why? And then like if I do this, what will happen next? That's all science, like if I shoot
Yeah.
these deer, if I don't shoot those deer, if I do this to the habitat, or, actually having a little bit of say in what happens in your success and what you see.
Yeah, it's hard to classify, what I do. I mean, for someone like yourself that works for an organization, and I mean, you're a deer biologist. I mean, you're a wildlife biologist, but you guys are deer biologists, right? But then you take a nomad like myself now, and I just call myself a natural resource biologist really more than anything. I mean, I am a certified wildlife biologist, but I do so many different things. But one of the things that really kind of solidified my thought process and really kind of digging this, wholeheartedly was because I started thinking about it. I'm like, as a wildlife biologist, obviously in biology, there's all the ologies, right? There's, biology, but that's like the daddy, category. There's microbiology, and on all the way down the ologies, right? But when you're a wildlife biologist, and I was explaining this to someone one time, I said, you have to think about what that means to actually be a deer biologist. You're not an expert in one particular thing. I said you're multifaceted because you have to understand the natural landscape ecology. You have to understand, botany. You have to understand how to identify, vegetation and plants. Because if you're just focusing on deer, what do they eat?
Mm-hmm.
You have to know what they eat, what they don't eat. That means you have to understand botany. How does a plant grow? How to ID and how to key out a plant. But then you have to understand, population ecology. How do you manage a herd? And then from the herd dynamic all the way down to the individual, and then from the individual on down to the cellular level. How are they metabolizing certain? I mean, if you think
No,
about it, I mean,
that's
think
fun.
about
That is really interesting, and you know why I'm like kind of laughing a little bit is that I've always thought, like cocktail speak, cocktail hour speak when you're out with your wife or significant other, and you meet somebody that's not from your field, and they say, "What do you do?" And you got like that 5-10 second thing to talk about what you do.
the elevator pitch,
Yeah,
man.
exactly, right? Like, and this happens. It doesn't matter what you do. Like, whatever your career choice is or your job, you say, all right, what am I gonna think about it. What am I going to say? And I've always thought if I say wildlife biologist, because I have that accolade, somebody's going to ask me about something that I don't know about. And I really don't. So
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, I'm going to say something more niche, which is deer biology. And they're like, oh, you mean like deer, like like the animal that you see? I'm like, yeah, I know a lot about deer. I
Yeah.
may not know a lot
Yeah.
about reptiles or amphibians. I know some, but I know a lot about deer. And I've always been like, that's a very specific thing that if they ask me a question, I'm in my end zone there. But what you're
Yeah.
saying is true. You do need to know a lot about plants, and you need to know about physiology, like how does
Yeah.
that disease work in their systems, or how, like,
Yep.
why do they digest the food that they do, and why does it work that way? It all is intermingled, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of training and you more hardcore biological sciences, microbiology, cellular physiology, I mean, all that stuff, But then it's like you get to the large scale side, and I've always thought about that because I'm the same way too. People hear, wildlife biologists, and they want to ask you like, hey, what about this bird? I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, guess what? And like when I teach my students, I tell them the same thing. I'm like, hey, because I teach more professional classes at the university. I teach junior and senior level. I'll teach forestry. I teach conservation of natural resources, wildlife resources. I teach about a handful of classes, just kind of depending on what's being offered. But I treat it like I'm like, hey, you guys aren't going to medical school, right? You're biology or conservation majors. You don't know what you want to do, but you're probably going to enter the consulting world. So I try to prepare them because I own consulting company. I work for a big engineering company. I'm like, I've been doing this for 15 years. I understand the industry very well. So, but we talk about that. I'm like, one of the things you're going to understand is you don't have to know everything.
No. Yeah.
You need to understand enough of what you don't know, but you need to be like, hey, you know what? Where to find the
Well,
information.
that's
You know,
true. And the great
you
thing
know,
about
be,
science, the systems in place for science is if you don't know an answer, whether somebody's asking you direct, like I get all, I'm sure you do too, like text from friends of friends, like, hey, what's this
all
track?
the
Or
time,
like,
all the time.
what's this? I may not know it, but I know how to find out the information. Like there are
Yeah,
resources, but there's also questions to ask and process of elimination, which is science. It's just
yeah.
saying it's not this, it's
It's
and kind of,
deductive reasoning.
yeah, exactly.
Oh, then you get your friends that are smart asses that are like, oh well, it's not. I'm like, I'm not there. You're 2 states away, man. Like, have you ever? Do you know what perspective is? Like, put a pencil down or something. Like, give me something. You're
Yeah,
taking a photo of this, and what is this? And I'm like, that you're giving me nothing to
yeah.
go off of. Like, could
Especially
be a
with
dog.
buddies, right? Like
Yeah,
you're
it's
always
half
expecting,
smeared
like, if
because
you don't know it, they're
yeah.
gonna give you a hard time. Like,
Oh, they
oh,
give you
I thought
shit
you were a
about it.
wildlife,
It's like,
you're a wildlife
yeah,
biologist. Why don't you know
exactly.
this?
Exactly. And on the other side too, I know, and I'm speaking for myself here, is because, yeah, I do hunt, but a lot of times I kind of I have friends that, that are in the industry. Like I got a friend that owns a trail cam company, Exodus Trail Cameras, and he'll be coming on, Chad, and other guys that I know, Dan, and these guys that'll also be on here. To me, they're what I think of as a hunter. Like they'll never admit it, but they're professional hunters. Like, I mean, they hunt year round, travel all over. They could explain to you hunting strategies like you couldn't imagine. I'm like, I can't even touch that. So it's always good to have those because they'll ask you questions and you're like, bro, man, you're making this way harder than it needs to be, man. Like I lost you halfway through. Like they're talking about all these different, weather measurements and stuff. It's like, yeah, I'm sure there's a play, but you're asking the wrong guy. Like, listen, I go out there because I've got like an evening off from travel softball with my kids or some other work obligation. I just want some peace and quiet.
Yeah.
But anyway, okay, let's get into this. So, with this episode, I wanted to talk about, because what you didn't mention is you are a forester as well. So I thought this would be a good episode to kind of talk about a point for me that I think is a very big one and something that's commonly overlooked. At least with the people that I talk to on properties and consult with and things like that is timber stand improvements. right? So I know, let's touch base real quick of what you guys got going on, because the NDA, a lot of people just see it as like a nonprofit, which you guys are, right? But they don't really understand behind the doors what you guys are actually doing, out there as far as helping legislation for whitetail across the range, but then either other projects. So let's kind of hit 2 points with this is kind of what are some of the things that NDA does, working with state legislators, and environmental agencies as far as deer regulations and how you guys help them. And then also, I think you had mentioned too the national project you guys got with the Forest Service. So kind of touch base on those things, because I think those are two highlighted features that would surprise a lot of people.
Sure, yeah, and we didn't get into my forestry background, but that consulting company I mentioned primarily was a forestry-based company. I was hired as a wildlife biologist, but it was there long enough that I ended up mentoring under the owner, and then wrote forestry prescriptions under his tutelage, and then ended up getting licensed. And so, for a period of time before I worked for QDMA at the time, that was my main job, was working with landowners and writing forestry and wildlife plans and giving and actually implementing that, like hiring subcontracting loggers. So totally into the forestry side of things. Um, from the, what do we do? Um, when the QDMA became the National Deer Association, we actually merged, and I'm assuming Kip talked about this on the other podcast, but we merged with another organization called the National Deer Alliance that was heavy in advocacy. And so at the time, we launched a strategic plan, and that strategic plan basically boils down our mission, um, which is to ensure the future of wild deer, wildlife habitat, and hunting. Those three pillars. Wild deer, where they live, and our ability to go out and pursue them as hunters. That is our mission. And there's four kind of areas or core elements to that. And so we work in policy, as you mentioned. So, getting out and working in policy, education. So what the QDMA was really well known for, and the deer steward courses we talked about, teaching hunters. There's millions, like not 9+ million deer hunters in the country, in the U.S. They all, many of them own land. Not everybody does. They all make a decision on what they shoot. So we can, and they can also make changes on the environment by changing the habitat. If we educate hunters, we're affecting an army of people that can make decisions. So education is one of those pillars. Recruitment of new hunters, we just talked about that. Getting new people afield, that's another whole category. And then the last category is deer diseases, like chronic wasting disease, the things that are having an impact. On the policy front with forestry, well, actually, just not in forestry alone. We have a policy director, Torrin Miller. He's actually in Washington, D.C. right now, as we speak. And so a big part of what we do is not only at the local level and state level, but also at the federal level, we have become this watchdog for hunters. There's lots of really good groups out there that do this, and a lot of them are species specific. Some of them are more ubiquitous, and they are more generalist in terms of what they look at. But when it comes to deer, if it impacts deer specifically, if there's legislation coming up at the county, state, or federal level, we are watching for it. If it's something that we think is good for deer, we put out action alerts to tell people to support it. If we think it's bad for deer and deer hunting, we ask you to oppose it. We come out with our own national statement, but we all have a grassroots action center that's there for that. And when it comes to forestry, there's a lot of things like the bipartisan federal infrastructure bill, really good for forestry at the national level. Um, I can tell you about things that are happening at the state level as well, but that's on a policy front. Um, Kind of from the grassroots perspective, beyond teaching people through our educational platforms, which we have online courses, you can attend them in person, like we mentioned earlier. You attended some of them. One of the biggest things that we can do is work with state wildlife agencies about the land that they manage and control, and working with the federal government, and primarily through the U.S. Forest Service. And so I'll tackle that last thing I mentioned first. We signed a memorandum of understanding, basically this big, broad umbrella contract with the Forest Service 20 years ago when we were the QDMA. It basically, in good stature, we're saying we're going to promote good work, you're going to promote us, and great. That's more theoretical, and that's really where we kind of stood for a long time. Is hey, we have an MOU. Um, with the Forest Service. But when we became the National Deer Association and we launched this new strategic plan, we have very specific action items and objectives in there and to strengthen our relationship and do more stuff on the ground with the Forest Service. And so that call to action really on me and my staff is, what are you going to do about it? And so we launched a national initiative, a campaign. It's a named campaign that's called Improving Hunting Access and Public Lands for Hunters. And we have a metric associated to that. We want to improve 1 million acres, literally 1 million acres, in the U.S. Forest Service system by 2026. And the way we're doing this is we have systematically been we signed a what's called a master stewardship agreement that kind of lives under the MOU that I mentioned, and we go forest by forest, basically state by state that has a national forest in it, and we start talking to those forest supervisors and the biologists and people that are the ranger districts and say, okay, listen, we're interested in deer. We have a membership that's quite large. There's millions of deer hunters out there that access your lands. How can we better manage those for deer and get more people, supporting of what you're doing? Because the Forest Service manages land for all the public, which is important. All the public has a say, just like deer are public animals. I mean, they are protected under the rights of all of us. They're not owned by anybody. The Forest Service manages and are caretakers of 190 plus million acres for all people. But unfortunately, um, a lot of the voices that become the loudest are not hunters. And
Yeah.
so proportionately, a lot of things that happen on there might be for other recreation, which is good, but we got to make sure deer hunters have a say. And so we go and just straight up approach these forests and say, for deer hunting, people use those lands. How can our voice become stronger? How can we have a better say in what's happening? And so this master stewardship agreement specifically allows us to go into the forest, identify projects that can need improvement, um, and it's what we call goods for services. We identify places within a forest that need improvement. Some of that might cost money, some of that could make money. And so that goods for services allows us to subcontract loggers, cut timber in the forest, which is not happening at a high enough rate. And the
No.
National Forest knows this. We will
Yeah.
go cut commercially valuable timber, sell it, that money goes into an account that's earmarked for that forest. That money, that revenue from the timber sales goes in, and the projects that cost money, spraying invasive species, improving access, whether that's roads, improving roads so people can get in there deeper, farther, whether that means improving parking. It could mean improving water quality. It could actually mean improving other species, not just deer. But
Yeah.
we sell timber, we take the money from it, and we use it. It has to be spent right there on that same forest for hunters so that they have a better experience. But as you know, deer habitat impacts other animals because they
Yeah.
are keystone species. They're generalists. So if we're improving the environment for deer, it's going to improve it for turkeys. It's going to improve it for, in some cases, quail, not always. It's going to improve it for non-game species, even threatened and endangered species. So from a member standpoint, if you're listening to this and you're not a member and you want to say, what's NDA doing for me? If you don't own land and you hunt public property, if you hunt national forest, that's something we're doing. We take your membership dollars and we're pouring it back into the national forest system to improve 1 million acres in the next couple years for you. Same thing with state agencies. I mentioned states. We have very close relationships with a lot of states, um, and one of the big things that we've been doing is promoting education to the managers of those states. We hold private trainings for wildlife management area biologists, foresters, people that control forests, and we tell them about, the type of stuff that Craig speaks on your
Yeah.
podcast about how they can manage their lands better. And we've had some really good success there as well, doing that. So that's,
Well, that
in a nutshell, what
yeah.
we do for any
How you
hunter.
doing on how you doing on time? What
I'm
how you
doing
doing on
good.
time?
Maybe 20 more minutes, 15,
Okay,
20
that's
more
fine.
minutes.
Yeah, we'll have to change the title of this. We'll have
Yeah.
to do this again. But yeah, because this is good. This is why I don't like really to have outlines when I do podcasts, because sometimes you organically go down a
Yeah.
path that's a good path to go down, and I got no problem continuing down that. We can touch a little bit on forestry, but touch on a couple things there, because a lot of people, when you're talking about working with the Forest Service, that's one aspect. You're working with the state agency. So I'm gonna say like Ohio as an instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the number. I want to say it's something like 95, 96% of the land base in Ohio is publicly owned, right? So I look at it and I tell people, when I talk with friends and family, or if I do, seminars or whatever, I always ask, like, what are you doing as a landowner
Well,
to help proliferate what's going on? I said, because here's the deal. Everyone wants to complain when they don't see deer. It's the state's problem. It's a state problem. Or it's you have 40 acres and 98% of it is an agricultural, row crop production.
mm-hmm.
And you hear Craig talk about the little bit like all the time and everything like that when it comes to management across your property. And it's like, what are you doing to help that? Because guess what? I use it as like I call it the turnpike model. I don't know if it's a good name or not, but it's like, I drive a lot for work and I use the turnpike a lot. And I was thinking about it a while ago and I said, I was listening probably to a podcast and someone was complaining about deer or whatever. I'm on a turnpike. I'm like, here I am on this turnpike. It's a part of my daily life, but there's nothing here. Like, I'm stuck traveling to where I am, and every 10 miles or 20 miles, there's a rest stop with food and a bathroom and a place that I can rest for a little bit, get some things that I need to go along my way. I said, that's very much what you see in a lot of deer habitat across where I work, because we know the home range of a whitetail isn't 10 acres,
Yeah.
right? They travel a lot. And if your property is shit and doesn't have a whole lot of resources, why do you think they're going to be there? And you have these conversations like, well, I got soybeans. Yeah, but there's no cover. They're not walking out into a soybean field in midday
Yeah.
or whatever. They're not safe. They don't feel safe doing that. And if they do, it's probably a young, rambunctious, button buck or some young, immature, deer, or just not a lot of experience. I said, if you're trying to shoot and harvest, mature deer, you got to put some work in, man.
Yeah.
They didn't get to be that age, as for nothing. So, what's your property boundaries like? What are your neighbors doing?
Yeah.
Your neighbors intensely managing. So don't complain to the state, because that's a big thing too. Why I push people to you guys is because of the education aspect that you guys have. Those deer steward courses, I tell everyone, are phenomenal.
Yeah.
Deer Steward 1 is phenomenal, more bookwork type of stuff. But Deer Steward 2, and I tell people, for my continuing education, a lot of times, even though we don't really get credits, for those, I still go. I've gone to the Habitat module, I think twice, and I'm like, but when you go there, there's people that work for state agencies that are there.
Yeah.
There's private landowners in there, and we all get to kind of intermingle with each other, with you guys. That part is what drives me crazy, is because there's resources out there, and you mentioned 9 million hunters. Let's be conservative, vastly conservative, and say 3 million of them own 40 plus acres. Do that math.
Yeah,
if
no,
they're managing that.
You're hammering it. I mean, some of the things that you just said kind of stirred my memory bank, and also so QDMA was formed in the 80s, primarily for the hunter, and as you just nailed it, is where do whitetails live? If you look at a range map of the U.S. and look at where whitetails live, they're primarily an eastern species. I mean, they do live in the Northwest, and there's some other places that they do. But if you drew a line right down the Rocky Mountain, the high elevation Rocky Mountains, most whitetails, like 90+% of them, are east of that line.
Yeah.
You know, that's where most of the hunters are too. Human populations out west are much lower, besides California, really. But like, where the bigger cities are, most of hunters, those 9.5 million hunters, 97% of the hunters are east of that line. That's where whitetails live. That's where hunters are. When you look at all and more people hunt deer than any other species. So most hunters are deer hunters. Now that statistic you just said about Ohio being, 95%, you said public, but
Yeah.
I know what you meant. It
Yeah.
was
Somewhere around there.
privately, like
Oh, did
95%.
I say
Yeah,
public? Yeah,
yeah.
private.
But I
My
knew
bad.
you meant. Same thing with
Yeah.
New York. Same thing with any state in the East. We don't have that much public land, even from the state, or, not talking about federal land, even from the state level. Most of the land in the East is private. It's like 84% of the land in that same area east of the Rockies is privately owned. Most of our public land holdings is BLM land, national
Yeah.
forest land, all that stuff out west. And so when you're talking about managing deer, whitetails, you're really talking about managing private land. Now,
Yeah.
we have dove into this public land management thing that I just talked about for a few minutes for a primary reason. Is when I talked about our 4 pillars, one of those was recruit, retain, reactivate, get new hunters out there, right? Most new hunters don't own their own land. And so where do they go? Most of them go to public land. A lot of them go to state or federal land. And so we have invested, part of the NDA's mission is improving public lands for new hunters and seasoned
Yeah.
hunters, not just that. But getting back to the bread and butter of who we are as an organization, where we were born, really, where we originated, is really about managing land. It doesn't matter if it's private or public. And that's where deer live. That's where they eat. That's where they're surviving. And if you want to learn about, improving odds, you need to improve both public and private, and most of it is private in these because that's where most whitetails live. And
Yeah.
yeah, Eric, you just said it, is how can you do that? Now, in 1988, when we were formed, that information was not easily readily available. Think about just the media streams back then versus now. It was like, car phones
Oh,
may have existed,
I
who
don't think
knows.
most people listening to this could even,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, think about, like I just said,
imagine that. Yeah.
I read about the job offering in the magazine. I don't even know, like Google didn't exist. Like none of that existed. But today, 2022, May of 2022, everybody, we were talking about this before you started recording, it's become so loud. Like the whole industry is just blown up. Like you can learn about food plots in a like 500 different posts online. You can learn about
Yeah.
timber stand
Like
improvement.
like that.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it's a lot of it's not
And
true. Like a lot
a
of it's
lot
faulty.
of it, just like any
Yeah.
information, I mean, there's a lot of bad information out
Yeah.
there. Well, I don't want to say bad information,
Is it based
because
on
one of the,
science? Talking about
well,
science,
yeah,
right?
and one of the things I try to tell people, and this is a very important thing to understand, and this goes for our profession as well, man. As wildlife biologists,
Yeah.
you can be a wildlife biologist and be terrible at your job,
Yep.
because I've seen it. I'm not saying anything in particular, but I've worked with other biologists, and I'm like, wait a minute, you want to do what? Like, that doesn't make any scientific sense, like,
Yeah.
for what our goals are, and with that being said, it's the same thing too. Like, I'll go out and talk to people, and they're like, yeah, I want to put this clover plot in. Okay. And I look at their product, I'm like, you have clover everywhere. I'm like, you build a McDonald's next to a Wendy's.
Yeah.
I'm like, what do you, like, diversity is key. You always need to think diversity. Whether you hire me or not, think of diversity.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't want everything here. But the things that get pushed are the sexy, photos of a beautiful clover plot, or a beautiful, someone holding a huge, purple top, and look at this. Well, no shit, they're going to eat it if it's there.
Ask the
But
question, like science says. Ask the
Yeah.
question: why do I need it?
why?
Yeah, like
Yeah,
why?
why?
Why? And so
Yeah.
a big part of managing land, and whether it's forests or other, vegetative components, trees. I mean, forest and trees are the same thing, but food plots, early cereal habitat, or like old field looking stuff. A lot of it comes down to writing when you write a management plan and you're looking at it, is say, what do I have? This is what wildlife biologist does.
Yeah.
You take an inventory.
Inventory. Yeah.
What is there? What's missing that deer need, or whatever your focal species is. Is it quail? Is it turkeys? Is it whatever? But you write that plan specific to your needs, your objectives. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? Well, I want good deer around. Okay, so what do deer need? So you have an inventory of what's available. You have a list of what they need, and there's a comparison of those two, what's missing, and then you write prescriptions, which is a fancy word to say, what do I need to create that's missing that they need? That's science, guys and girls.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
creating a roadmap of developing that. And now there's a lot of fly-by-night folks out there. There's a lot of good people too, but I've seen YouTube videos
absolutely.
and recommendations of people that make claims, and those claims, unfortunately, are coming from anecdotes. A lot of things that have to do with science have to do with validation. Like, you test something, does it work? Yes or no? You repeat it. You say, okay, that person tested it. Let's repeat it. And if you can get multiple credible sources saying this works and this doesn't, then you implement the things that work, and you try to stay away from things that don't. And so I know I'm getting a little heady here, but like,
Oh no,
that's really
it's something that we
what
deal
it is
with
all about.
all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, and again, you don't even, and there's a lot of guys out there too that aren't biologists that have good stuff, because I try to tell people, I'm like, hey, listen, as a wildlife biologist, our job, if you're good, if you're a good manager, right, is taking the science and blending the art with it, because you can have as many degrees as you want as an art person, and if you can't understand how to mix colors properly and how to paint, it ain't gonna matter. But at the same time, you have people that are just gifted artists that never spend a day learning what colors to mix, and you see certain things that happen that maybe at the front level, we're looking at this, go, why are you doing that? And then you start, like you said, it starts becoming successful, and you're like, okay, maybe there's something to this.
And a lot of it's repeating testing, like, or always checking in on yourself is like, the QDM, quality deer management model, it really was born because of that need of improving land for deer, and age structure, and composition and sex ratio and all these fancy biological terms. But a lot of it was like, hey, let's make things better. And if you are improving on something, you want to check on it, and just like, with anything, any good relationship comes with like a marriage. You got to have good communication. You got to check in with your spouse and say, why did that bother you? Or like, there's a lot of that comes down to like checking in and monitoring. With deer hunting and deer management, you set that plan at the beginning, you start down the road, and you really do have to check back in on your system and say, how am I doing? And that's collecting data, right?
That's what separates the good from the bad.
Yeah.
That's what separates the good consultant from the bad consultant, for sure. Because, listen, nothing's going to go to plan.
No.
A plan is just the first thing that goes wrong.
And things change.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And again, talk about the range. Here in Ohio, I don't know the average, but most people that I know, a 40-acre piece of property is a pretty good size, from where I am here. So, I mean, you think of that from a deer home range, perspective. You got this plan, great, but you don't know what, Joe down the road is going to shoot on his property that you know what I'm saying? Like, and the population dynamic changes, which is going to have a massive influence on what's going to go on everywhere else. And, but from the habitat component, I get frustrated a lot because I've literally had it before to where, you go out and do kind of like this talk, say, hey, what's your goals? Let's talk about what you want to do and things like that. And just from a broad, eye perspective here, I can tell you, well, we were talking off air, you got this, big production row crop field, but you want to put food plots in, but you've got food.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that you don't have food. You've got early season food. You've got growing season food. What about the winter stress months? There's nothing here.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with upland game bird habitat is, we'll go out there and look at some of these pheasant farms and things like that. And it's like, well, you look at the transitional edge and it's like, well, there's cover here. I'm like, yeah, because it's June. Most of that's garlic mustard and invasive species anyway, that come wintertime is going to be down on the ground. And now what? Now, feral cats, red tails, I mean, you name it, are going to pick off a bob white or a ringneck or whatever. I mean, there's no cover here, and you're focused on this one aspect, which is the aspect that gets put so much at the forefront because, again, it's from the marketing standpoint, what's easier to sell? Going out there and taking a photo of a timber stand that's a secondary growth, even age stand that you can see, 300 yards through and talk about a TSI, or show this awesome, beautiful, lush food plot with your 10-year-old daughter holding this big purple top turnip.
Yeah.
And it's like, hell yeah, I want to text that to my friends. Like, look at what I got.
Then you go out there talking about trends. Been here long enough. I think we both have at this point. Been here long enough. You watch kind of trends in deer management, and going back into the 2000s and even tens, late 2000s or early tens when we both started our careers. Food plots were the rage, and they still are very, very popular. But just monitoring what people talk about on social and YouTube videos, because it's everywhere. Like we just said, it's flooded. Like everybody's talking about this stuff. I have noticed the conversation is changing to doing more in the woods. Like you see people talking about timber stand improvement or forest stand improvement or doing stuff with chainsaws more now than you did 10 years ago. And you see people talking about burning more now than they did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, not to sound old, man, but like
people would freak out if you talked about burning.
But yeah, there was like food plots was it. So there is like a media trend with like, especially like people that are, what do you call them? Not professional hunters. They're capturing those TikTok videos or YouTube videos of them with a drip torch or out there with a chainsaw. That stuff was not happening a decade ago. But just like with food plots, there's good advice in ways that you should do it, and then there's like ill-advised advice, or there's not there's right and wrong ways, but there's certainly unsafe things that you should do when it comes to some of those other techniques. And then there's also the why factor. It's like I watch people burning, and they're like, we're doing this for the deer. But you just, from a science standpoint, you watch like what they're burning, when they're burning, the scale of that they're burning, and just be like, that's really not going to help deer. It looks cool, and here's why. And I'm not trying to be like a jack, but it's like what we have tried to do over the years at NDA is teach people the science from guys like Craig and other really good researchers out there, what they've learned, and taking that and just say, here's free, in some cases free. I mean, we do charge to come to our classes, but we have stuff online on our website and our videos that are free.
Huge backlog of
and
stuff.
Just be like, here's what we know. Take it, learn it, go do it. I mean, like, I don't know. Not to.
I'm laughing.
I'm sounding sour, I guess. But
hey, man, this is honestly, this is what I think people need to hear is this kind of stuff. Because you don't hear it that much. And again, it's not in no way, shape, or form we trash it. It's just like anything. You have good doctors, you have bad doctors.
Yeah.
How do you identify the good doctor versus the bad doctor? If the doctor's telling you McDonald's isn't bad and eat it as much as you want, you're not going to go to him.
Always ask
or
why.
her, whatever.
I've learned
but understand your why is another one too. You got about 10 more minutes, or what time?
I'm really enjoying this.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's go about 10 more minutes.
But let's go to quarter.
We got podcasts and episode. We can do part 2. One thing I'll say though is kind of moving into the forest is it is something that a lot of people don't. They're starting to pay attention to, and I would simply just kind of. as a segue into the next episode that me and you do together is if you're really interested, is understand what you have, and at the very least, look at ways of opening up your canopy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, out of anything, if I could give one, elevator pitch on what should I focus on with my timber, opening up your canopy. That's to me kind of the first place to go, because you don't know what you're going to unlock until you do. To sit there. I mean, obviously, ideally, what do you have? Do you have is it more of a, oak, hickory, whatever,
It doesn't even matter.
composition you have.
Yeah.
But opening
Yeah.
the canopy is number one.
I just
because
wrote a,
deer live from 6 feet down, baby.
Yeah,
Like it's just.
I just wrote a blog for our website about a month or two ago that it was one of those like moments where it's like, I can't believe we don't have something online about this, but like, what deer eat. And I wrote in there, people will be surprised. It has a breakdown of the diets, what they're eating. They do eat material that grows at the ground level in forests a lot. It's a major it's probably the biggest proportion of their diet. And the reason being is what you just said with cover and food. Like deer need food, cover, water, and space. That's habitat. That's a definition of habitat. And where do you get most of your cover? Deer are going to be in cover. A lot of that is in forested areas, right? Like even in crop country, they will bed in those crops, but they're only there for a period of time. If you look at the whole year, they're going to go to where there's structure. And a lot of that is in forested areas, even if it's little islands of it. And so they're spending a large amount of time in cover, and they're going to be eating while they're in those places. And so what you just said, 6 feet down, is where they can reach. They can't climb up a tree. And so the best food comes from when there's more sunlight, because sunlight stimulates growth. We all know the basics of plant development are they need water, soil, and sun, right? And so when you go into a stand of trees, one of the first things you should be doing is looking up. Don't worry about what the trees are. Don't worry about spacing. Just look up and say how much sunlight is coming down.
Yeah.
And then,
I mean, look at an aerial. Look at Google Earth, down on there and see. And, one of the things I try to tell people also is understand your woods, understand your timber. Like, where are the deer trails? There's apps like Onyx, right? I mean, there's beautiful apps out there. Say, okay, here's my trails. Here's a rub, here's a scrape. And then you start looking at that and zooming that out from an aerial, and you can see trends from in there. Then you start opening canopy. But I know, where I hunt on my parents' property, I have really good success over there because I know I can follow the resources. Like there's a large area. It's semi upland / wetland in a lot of areas, and you get a lot of jewelweed formation that kind of goes along there, and they hammer that. And it's like just understanding as one example of a resource that they're programmed to eat, right? And look at that and find those. Why are they spending so much time here? You start looking around, and I'm like, that's jewelweed, but the inflorescence is gone. The orange bulbs are gone. And you start looking, I'm like, oh yeah, they're eating this, right? So you start looking around. Well, deer on my property. Now, jewelweed's a pretty favorable food.
Yeah.
But we talked about earlier, there's certain things that on properties you're like, why the hell did that work? But on that property, it works. This is what they have. And understand, no one knows your property better than you, so understand, especially if you're a hunter. We talked about those days where maybe you don't see a whole lot of anything, but maybe you do. And maybe you're just out there getting observation data. It's all data that you can use to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And I'm looking around too. And a lot of times I'll be like, man, there's a lot of beech trees here. Like, this shit needs to kind of go a little bit. Like, you start looking around like, okay, checklist for next year. Like, we got to remove, some of these, I don't want to say undesirable trees, but, you start kind of making those management plans.
And why do you say that? And you say that because you always go back to, from the management plan, you lay that out at the beginning and say, here's my overall objective is to do X, Y, and Z. And then what's out there determines whether or not you're going to achieve that success. So beech is not, it's a tree deer don't really they'll eat the nuts, the mass that comes off of it, but not preferred.
It's not preferred.
It's not preferred. It's a tree that They will not browse, and if they're browsing it, they're in really dire straits. So that means like
Yeah.
biting the leaves and branches. And it's a tree that will shade out other things, so you don't really have anything to grow. So that's a species. That's an example you mentioned earlier about knowing all the different attributes of deer management. You do need to know all these ologies. So you need to be able to identify the tree. You need to know that it's not good for deer in the general sense. For some reasons, if you have a lot of it, you want to reduce it. How do you do that? There's
Yeah.
techniques that you learn to do that, and so
Yeah.
that's a lot. But the root, you as a listener, if it's something that you want to dive into, you can hire a consultant. I made my living doing it. You do it now, and there are great consultants out there. But Eric just said, you also know more than you think. And you do know your property better than he or I would ever. And you have the ability to learn this stuff and managing it on your own. We actually have a free template, like a management plan template that you can go online and fill out. And it's got
Yeah.
hyperlinks in there that you can click on and read about different things. And then you write down what you saw on your own property. And so don't be afraid to be your own manager,
Yeah.
but also don't be afraid to ask for advice, because there are
Don't be
people out
afraid.
there that know.
Don't be afraid to fail, because we've all failed.
Oh, yeah.
It's certain things. Oh, this is absolutely going to work. You're like, this did not work.
work.
Yeah, but all right. So Matt, let's wrap this up. I know you got to get going. So I not the we wanted to focus more on forestry, but like I said, these organic conversations, man, I think are much better podcasts than kind of forcing your way around. But I think this is a good segue for a part 2. So we could definitely have to reconnect when our schedules align and do a part 2, and we'll really dive into some timber stand strategies and improvement techniques and things like that. So tell everyone how they can reach you if they want, where to find you, and then we'll get this thing wrapped up.
Sounds good, and I would love to come back on a part 2 and talk about some of that. Let's do it. Let's get it on the calendar. So you can find us at deerassociation.com. You can email me at matt@deerassociation.com, just first name, 2 T's. And always available, happy to talk to folks that are interested in deer or habitat management.
Yeah, and I'll have everything for Matt's contact information in the link below for if you're watching this on YouTube and everything like that. So, all right, Matt, well, I appreciate it, man. I know you got it going, so let's wrap this up. Till next time, everybody, thank you for joining us, and we will see you soon. Bye, everybody. And that's a wrap on another episode of the Hunt Science Podcast. I want to thoroughly take this time to thank everybody who has listened or even watched till the end of this episode and had the opportunity to hopefully enjoy the show that we put out for you. It's something that we're really trying to do and take notes and put good quality content for everybody to enjoy. We want to take this moment also to, if you enjoyed the show, check us out over on our social media platforms. Give us a like, give us a follow, check that bell notification, look for the content that we're putting out. Of course, reach out to us, leave comments. Did you like the show? We would love to hear your reviews of the show and any concerns that you have, any updates or any type of feedback to make our content better. We're always open ears for the people that are consuming our show and our content. We want to hear from you. What is it that you want to see, and what is it that you would like us to do? If you want to check us out on any of our social media, first off, you can head over to our website, go to www.huntsciencepodcast.com. You can check us out on Instagram at huntscience_podcast, or you can check us out over at our Facebook page at The Hunt Science Podcast. Any of those is open. You can, like I said, feel free to comment and all of the above that you do with social media. I just want to take this time again to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for everybody for watching and listening to the content that we're putting out. It means the world to me, and I can't wait for you guys to join us on another episode. Until then, everybody, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.